Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Excited to have Andrew Paul back on the show. He is the Director of Performance and Rehabilitation for the Oklahoma City Thunder. Andrew is both a sports performance coach and a physical therapist. He has the lenses of that athletic performance and then biomechanics models. And this is essentially a part 2 of the last episode we did, where we talked about individual factors in training and observing athlete movement on the level of absorbing and propulsion based motions. So on the show today, we'll be getting into foot dynamics, forefoot-oriented elastic athletes, rearfoot-oriented, midfoot, more muscular-driven athletes. We'll be talking about movement screens, Andrew's take on that, and much more on the show. It's great having Andrew on. He is such a wealth of information and excited to get this show going for y'all. So let's get to episode 419 here with Andrew Paul. Andrew, welcome back to the show. I know we had a bunch of questions left over from last time that I'm really excited to get into here. And I know you've also had some time off from after the NBA season. So hope you've got some good rest, and I'm looking forward to getting on these topics here.
No, man, I'm like very excited to be back on this. So I told you I was a big fan. And it's funny when you get on the podcast, you start going back and listening to all of the people that were on there before you that maybe you didn't listen to before. And you realize I could have done a better job because they did a better job than I did. So I got some time off. So hopefully you have a more lucid mind to talk to than mid-playoff brain. So.
Yeah, well, hey, I love the last one. So if what we had on the last one was playoff brain, I'm really excited for today. And I know too, like just going through your presentation and hearing about some of the hybrid athletes, which I know we'll get into a lot, super intriguing. One thing you said though on that on the YouTube presentation, I think I put it on the show notes maybe, or some people were asking about it, but you had mentioned your use of the functional movement screen or FMS, and I know that's a pretty debated thing. You know, does it actually predict injuries, and why do we even use it if it isn't predictive, and these types of ideas? So I'm super curious about your use of that and in the midst of your assessment process.
Yeah, well, that topic alone is going to bring up a whole hour-long podcast.
Yeah.
So I'll solve the debate for everyone and say that it does not predict injury. I think the evidence on that's pretty clear. I did go through a phase in my career where I was using it pretty heavily, particularly when I was in college, because I think the functional movement screen is meant to be used at scale. And in my current environment, we only deal with 18 players. And so we don't really need anything that's utilized at scale. So I am a follower of the functional movement systems. I'm an SFMA practitioner, which is the selective functional movement assessment, which is a little bit more individualized. So I want to talk about probably two things related to that. One is what I mentioned in the presentation and how that came up in the presentation, and then the second is how I view the concept of movement ability fitting into the absorption propulsion puzzle. So what I mentioned in the presentation was I was discussing the difference between heavily propulsive muscular movers and absorption style or elastic fascial movers. And one of the things that I mentioned was that because propulsive movers tend to rely on deep ranges of motion, and the reason why they rely on those things is because they're using a long concentric pushing action to create momentum. They tend to have more access to range of motion. They tend to, in something like the FMS, score higher than someone who's very fascial or elastic in nature. And that has led a lot of people to say, I say, the strength coach always looks at these muscular movers and like, oh, wow, what a great mover they are. And it's because those types of movers really look good in the weight room when they're squatting, really look good in the weight room when they're doing a full clean butt to heels and things of that nature. And the reason is that because they need that range to create propulsive action. And on the flip side, when you have someone who's more elastic in nature, particularly the extremes, they tend to have more mechanical stiffness at joints. And as a result, they look a lot worse when they do something like the FMS. And that's not to say that they're a worse athlete or they're more injury prone or any of those things. They tend to score lower. And just because they rely on very, very short reversals of eccentric energy. And that's just characteristic of how they move. And so that's how it came up in the presentation. And from that being said, there was a period of time where I did heavily rely on the FMS, and I think that period of time have allowed me to evolve my understanding of of what I'm actually looking at when I do something like that. So I'm grateful I did. Now, what I use is SFMA, which is, I'm a PT by background. And so it's a little bit more individualized and allows me to look at individual joints, and how that fits into this conversation is kind of like a weird aside of these two things. And um, you can view absorption and propulsion in terms of force production and athletic styles, and you can also view absorption and propulsion in terms of the movement demands on the body during certain phases of movement. And what I mean by it is, when I'm going to produce force and I'm going to create momentum, I call that propulsion. Your body's going to go through a very predictable sequence of joint actions. And the strength conditioning community knows this one because we talk about it a lot, because the series of joint actions that are go along with propulsion start from the ground up. And it's if I start from the foot, it's plantar flexion, supination of the foot. It's external rotation of the tibia and knee extension. It's hip extension and external rotation. And then we call all those triple extensions. So that's a very common thing to look at, be like the triple extension. That's how you produce force, and propulsive movers rely on that. The one thing that I would always add is the torso always rotates away from the leg producing the force. You can see that in running all the time. And so the SFMA gives you a method by which to, and this is just typical table exam, to assess each one of those joints, right? And see if there's something missing or something not moving well, or if it's adapting poorly over time. On the flip side, the absorption pattern is almost the exact opposite, where if I'm in basketball anyway, with my feet on the ground, I'm interacting with gravity. When a force is imposed upon me, we call that absorption. And I follow a very predictable sequence of events. I pronate and dorsiflex. That allows my tibia to internally rotate. That allows my knee to flex. My hip on that side will flex, internally rotate, and adduct. My spine will actually flex and rotate towards that leg. And that's a very predictable sequence of events if you're going to land hard on something and you need to absorb over a long period of time. And so the SFMA gives us the ability to assess each one of those joints, find a potential restriction or limiting factor in the ability to up the chain, and maybe address that either through a manual technique or an exercise technique. And so I view absorption and propulsion as more than just weightlifting and more than just force output or movement. And also, to me, it's a movement paradigm. And I hope it's relatively timeless in nature, in that it's not linked to a certain acronym of methodology or thought process. And it will withstand the test of time, that people who absorb force, they will produce force, and they will do so in these joint positions. They will do so in very similar ways. So that's the carryover of the FMS mentality and this movement paradigm, I guess.
Yeah. Right off the bat, you were talking about the FMS. It's kind of biased towards, like you said, more concentric movers, people who use their muscles, who can squat better. And it reminded me, I think it was, I think this anecdote is accurate, but someone at least said like, oh, LeBron James had like a terrible score or something like that. And look at how he's so resilient. But he's he just went between the legs and dunked at age 39, and very like single leg jumper type. I'm sure he's obviously very strong, but a very elastic mover. Probably doesn't love deep squatting. So it makes me think almost like maybe there should be a version of that. And obviously the SFMA is more nuanced. Like I've seen the SFMA, it's a lot more in depth. And it seems, a lot more nuanced with the joints and how each joint acts. But I almost feel like if there was like an FMS concentric edition, FMS elastic mover edition, and then like you said, like it's almost more, I'd be curious to your thoughts on this, is would an assessment be more about how an athlete manages their movement within their preferred ranges of motion, much more than asking them to do a range that they don't actually really use within their playing style?
Yes. And we're like, you're going to bring me in. I kind of told you this is when we get into hybrids and different forms of elastic and different forms of muscular movers. There's actually different, and some things I've learned is there's different motions you really want to pay attention to, because LeBron falls into a very specific category of elastic mover to me, and there's others that do not. But as a therapist, I want to pay attention to different actions than just like their gross overhead squatting ability. and I'll give you an example. LeBron is what I consider to be a 4 foot elastic person. And a 4 foot elastic person usually has, they're usually 1 foot jumpers. They usually are built to project themselves horizontally. If you ever think about LeBron moving down the court and one of his, all of his dunks that are highlight worthy are one leg dunk, tomahawk dunks.
Mm-hmm.
All of them, he kind of slow plays the first half of the court in transition. And then all of a sudden you'll see him kind of take off down the middle of the lane. And that's how he plays. And that's very characteristic of like what I would say is like a 4 foot elastic person. Now, um, there's the with 4 foot people, usually the things you're paying attention to is tone along the posterior chain. And the reason why you would pay attention to that, I think the sport word would be like high PF stiffness, high plantar fascia stiffness. These people are usually have the most scrunched up feet. You can look at a picture we've seen both LeBron's feet. They usually have a lot of hallux valgus at their big toe. They're built to push off the front of their 4 foot, and they collect a lot of tone along the plantar fascia, along the hamstring, along the gastroc soleus complex. And so for them, the goal isn't to change their straight leg raise to a 3 to say they're good now. Mm-hmm. The goal is throughout the course of a season is to monitor that muscle tone that they have. And if you have really good palpation skills and really subtle views of changes of range of motion, you can tell if they're negatively adapting to the game load, to their training load, or whatever it is. Now, LeBron, he did tear his plantar fascia, but that was the age of like 38 or whatever.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
But, at that point in time, it's like you won the game. Man.
Yeah,
like
yes.
You figured out how to be a very endurable 4 foot elastic player. And so that's an example of someone who, based on how they move, you want to pay attention to different aspects of what their table testing is telling you. And I kind of have general checkpoints for each one of those, to some extent. So yes, you do. I do pay closer attention. I don't necessarily have a different screen for them, but I pay closer attention to different aspects of someone's table testing based on what their movement motor is. And that has proven to be a pretty good rule of thumb for me with a 4 foot elastic, is to pay attention to foot pliability, gastroc muscle tone, posterior chain muscle tone. I imagine in the track world, you have a lot of that.
Yes.
That is the sport. So the basketball is a little bit more variable with some other types of people, but that's for someone like him, that's exactly how I would be screening him out every day.
Yeah. With there's a lot of interesting, like, I feel like that in itself, like you mentioned, the whole FMS could be a whole 1 hour conversation. I feel like even the 4 foot and rear foot elastics and those types, and where is there common issues where they get tight or where they need more work, or I believe we covered it last time. If you're an elastic, you have to basically have stronger calves. And because if you mess up your lower leg or your foot, like it's going to take a lot longer to get back because that's your engine and that's your motor. I was going to ask, I guess maybe where I'll take that is, we had talked about elastics in general. It's like the calf and lower leg. Would you say for a 4 foot elastic, like their common injury is more even the foot than like a rear foot, I guess a rear foot elastic, like a rear foot elastic, maybe more lower leg or Achilles or something? Or is there anything between a 4 foot, like a LeBron? And I'd be curious what a rear foot elastic is like. Like now that you got me thinking, I guess maybe someone who's more heel heavy and single leg jumping would probably be maybe who's a little bit slower. Like I know LeBron's fast too. There's those old videos of him like running like 20 miles, hitting 20 miles an hour in cross court sprints and things like that. I mean, I don't think a rear foot type, like a lopey, single leg jumper could pull that off. So I'd be curious what the little differences there.
I think so. Just keep in mind, this is how I've learned to best describe these things in my own head. And so like, I don't think I'm just trying to explain how I view the world. And I don't want to label someone and someone comes back and argues and will,
of course,
you're not using the rear foot, whatever. To me, a rear foot elastic is someone, and we see that, and I'm describe this, you're gonna be able to tell who I'm talking about. Rear foot elastics really use their tripod well when they go from horizontal to vertical. And so what I mean by that are they really I think you show a lot of videos of the triangle position they reach. Mm-hmm. These people, when they approach a jump, they're going from horizontal to vertical. These are the most impressive types of people because they'll get down the court and they'll go from straight horizontal to over the top of the backboard. And what happens when you slow that down is they take a penultimate and their lead leg is really back on their heel and their torso is like quite a bit behind their foot.
Yeah.
So they're still moving, but their torso is still almost vertical to the ground. And so they have this great ability to counter nutate their sacrum. So get a little posterior pelvic tilt, really get their feet out in front of them. And then as they hit their rear foot, they start winding around into a tripod and then they kind of launch themselves over the top. And so what this person is using is spiral energy. And so they're really springboarding from their rear foot off their forefoot with no really touching in between. And they're really using spirals around their hip to create a lot of spiral energy to get themselves moving. So that's a jumping technique that's pretty impressive to watch. It's also in basketball, these people do a really good job staying behind their feet. And so these people have amazing step back ability, where, you know, they can really get you moving one way. And because they're behind their feet, they can halt themselves and create an impulse to create separation backwards. So to me, that's a rear foot elastic. And what they're doing is they're showing a great ability to stay behind themselves, use their rear foot as a plant surface, and also use spirals. And so these people generally on the table have a lot of hip internal rotation available. They also tend to lose it over time if you don't keep it in check. And so what I'll see is you can lay these people down on the table right away, and almost always they have, you know, some version of above a standard deviation away from the typical NBA norm in hip IR availability in prone. Just let them fly open, and they have a lot. Part of that is pelvic orientation. That's natural to them. You have to have a almost like a posterior pelvic tilt when you do that. For me, it's like more the counter-nutated sacrum orientation that gives them that IR. But if you allow that IR to diminish over time because of stress, then you're gonna have a problem down the chain. And when I say IR at the hip, it's obvious. At the knee, they need to keep it quite a bit too. And that falls into the absorption range of motion I kind of mentioned. But in this case, for a rear foot, when I see that as a primary driver, I'm making sure I'm checking those actions on a daily basis or those availabilities, because when they lose that, they lose their motor and their ability to wind. And you start having ligamentous type risk factors popping up. So to me, that's a rear foot elastic, and where they're usually smaller guys. They have a great amount of movement variability as far as their ability to get in different shapes. And for me, when I look at a movement screen or something for them, like I said, I'm making sure I'm managing rotation, either passive motion or control of rotation is a big one, versus for a 4-foot elastic who's more built for the single leg takeoff from the free throw line. Maybe the best breaks in the world, but gets downhill pretty well. I'm managing more posterior chain, plantar fascia, soleus, gastroc, hamstring complex, so on and so forth. And those two present very differently on the table. Like when you get them on a table, their ranges are different. And then their movement selection in the weight room is usually a little bit different, and they tend to gravitate towards different things. And I'll explain that. One thing they're very similar is that they both have very rigid midfoot complexes. And the reason is that a rear foot likes to land hard on the rear foot, bypass the midfoot, and get off the forefoots. They're kind of like pole vaulting their way over the top, and they need that rigid midfoot to be able to do that. The forefoot is also rigid midfoot usually, but it's generally from like the plantar fascia and the tissues more so than the foot complex itself. So I've seen a lot of rear foot elastics with like a hard pronated foot, like it's pronated, but it's a rigid pronation position where the midfoot doesn't move very well, versus a soft, sloppy pronation. So that's when we talk about hybrids. That's what kind of I mean. Like they're an elastic, but they're a very specific kind of elastic. They're a rear foot elastic where they got really good brakes. They're going to stay behind themselves. You're going to see a different style of play there. The acceleration strategies of the two are different. One of them I call is like a very squatty acceleration. The rear foot is a very like low to the ground, squatty kind of glider. The forefoot is almost like a lean downhill, and you'll see like a straight up lean, and like it's a bowling ball going downhill. So they're different strategies. And weight room wise, just what I've seen is that rear foot elastic people, they actually tend to like squatting motions a lot, particularly with their heels elevated, because it gives them the feeling of being behind their feet, which is like something that, like when your feet are elevated, it's like you're walking downhill and your body is just back. And they tend to really do well with that. Whereas the forefoot people, they tend to like, they do not like their feet. Neither of these, they don't, the forefoots do not like their feet by the bilateral stance very often,
Yeah.
from what I can tell. These are the ones, if you try to do Olympic lifts with them, they always end up jumping forward. They're like constantly moving forward. And so they kind of get up on their toes too early. The bar gets out in front of them and they end up collapsing forward and can't catch it. And so what I've found with them is usually some sort of asymmetrical stance. They love step up variations. Floating heel variations are their jam. And so I've just learned they tend to be able to do things differently and gravitate towards different things. It's a reflection of, I think, how they move. But again, anyone listening to this, I will just say, this is how I've learned how to describe the world around me. This is not like, I'm not trying to generate a nomenclature or terminology to be universal. This is just my observations and what I've learned. So I hope that makes sense. That's two different kinds of elastics that kind of gets in the hybrid conversation. There's two different ways to utilize movement screening for those two. And then it kind of got into exercise selection for the two of them also.
Yeah, no, I love that. And my view of that would be, in many ways, I don't think it's always 100% one-to-one here, but in track and field, it's kind of like long jump versus high jump. Long jump is a lot more forefoot elastic, and high jump is more rear foot because, well, in high jump, you spend more time on the ground. There's more twisting motions. I mean, I'm most certainly, as you're describing it, I'm like, yes, I am most definitely a rear foot elastic jumper. My long jump was, compared to my high jump, my long jump was trash. And I just didn't have, I just also just didn't have the runway speed, but even how I took off was a little bit different. And I think my high jump was also good because I was able to use extra twisting because the curve, you run the curve. And even when anybody jumps off one leg, they like to run just a little bit of an arc oftentimes. You know, I mean, sometimes it's straight down the floor, but that little subtle arc can wind up that twisting energy more as well. So it's interesting.
I think we are. I'm not a track expert, and I spend a lot of time watching basketball, obviously, and I think we are describing very similar things and how they present themselves in different sports. Because I've read your book, and working with a different sport may give you a different perspective of things, but like the forefoot elastic to me is built for the long jump.
Yes.
It's like, these are the guys that jog down the court and dunk from the free throw line, but they're also the guys that don't have like a power dunking ability. Like they need a lot of runway to get their way up there. And then the rear foots is a lot what you're talking about. They kind of have to move in a spiral. These are the people that kind of turn the corner to go downhill. And then you're going to see them turn their shoulder to the rim a little bit to get an angle so they can kind of, you get in their tripod and leap. And that's, when it's done well, it's very impressive. So I think, and they're the ones that are the most suited for horizontal to vertical displacement, to take horizontal momentum and like move to a vertical displacement. So, like I said, I'm not a track expert, so I won't get caught breaking that down a little bit, but hearing you talk, I think we're talking about very similar concepts.
Yeah. No, I feel like too, I mean, this would be a track rabbit trail, but infusing these into preferred practices. Well, the thing is, high jump and long jump often train relatively similar in the weight room in most track circles, but there is some distinctions, I think, and it'd be interesting to take some of the movements that you see for the players. And again, though, like track is like, hey, let's take your ability and max it out. Let's set the razor's edge, total max, every, inch of distance or height counts. Whereas basketball, it's like, don't get hurt, be strong and fast, but also stay robust. And let's pull the brakes a little bit more when we need to. So it'd be interesting. I'm sure that would be an interesting conversation on what those two types like in the gym. And I definitely, being an observer, I like squatting. Like when I did too much, too heavy, it has messed me up at various periods of time, but a little bit was always quite good for me versus like I could see someone who's like a LeBron, or when he squats, it's like very wide. He clearly doesn't like his feet to go. I actually like squatting with my feet close together, and I love heels elevated. So it's like you're speaking my language there. So that makes sense. It's just an interesting area.
Yeah, the forefoot elastic types are the worst. Like when it comes to we talk about those are the worst FMS movers you ever seen. Those are the ones that like their heels come off the ground the second they try to go down and anything. They don't like bilateral stances. So yeah, you've seen the LeBron videos where he gets crushed by like the trolls on the video, like, you should be doing, and it's like he's figuring out how his body's best
Yes.
going to perform that motion. And that's very typical of a lot of people that move the way he does, is like he's going to figure out how to widen his base and get like a little bit of a hinge and get back. But like anyone online who watches that and doesn't see what an unbelievable athlete looks
Yes.
like trying to squat,
Yes.
like that's very typical.
Yeah, all the people critiquing are probably concentric, like, knee dominant concentric types critiquing a 4-foot dominant elastic athlete who's finding a way his body works and what interests him in the gym. I had something else that was related, but I cannot. Well, I'll ask you one thing that's maybe maybe this will help me to refine the question that I had in my head. But you had mentioned floating heel, and I guess it's an interesting thought in the sense that, well, a 4-foot elastic, like naturally they're great at floating heel, right? But what about like someone who needs more like 4-foot strength? It's like a strengths versus weaknesses thing, I guess you could say. So yeah, I'm just curious with that, like strengths, weaknesses, or is it like just options? Like, hey, I just move better when it's off my 4-foot and I feel good, like balancing that out.
Yeah. So it's going to get us in a whole different conversation about how I view. I'm like very detailed on how I ask players to bear weight to their feet at different times, and so I'll explain that real fast, and then what I mean by floating heel. So I went down the floating heel path like everyone did. I think 4 or 5 years ago, that was a big deal, and there's different ways to float your heel. And what I mess with my own training, and you can have a very low heel with like a minor heel lift, and that's a floating heel. And then you can have a high heel on the like. And so for me, like that was I'm just one of those people that's going to dive into like the deepest angle I can to figure it out. So the thing that we've decided in our weight room is I want to make the distinction between, I said muscular movers are midfoot people. Elastic can be rear foot or forefoot people, and they tend to live there. And so I wanted to define what this meant for our players, because they're not going to be able to understand. I wanted, like, you should feel the weight here when you're doing this. And so I define the midfoot as when a majority of your weight is on the back side ball of your foot. So if you take the ball of your foot and you have a posterior side of it as far back as you can go on your forefoot or on your ball of your foot, and then you have a 4-foot side of it, which is as far forward as you get of the ball of your foot. And what happens when you get to backside ball of your foot is the skin of your heel is basically on the ground, but it's not on the ground. So it's very little, like maybe 10% of your weight, 5% of your weight. To me, that is a midfoot position. That's where people deadlift from. And they're not slamming their heel into the ground. It'll be on the ground, but for the most part, they're bearing weight through their midfoot when they're on the backside ball of their foot. And this could be arguable. I realize some people are 50-50. For me, for an athlete, that's like where I ask them to be. And it's for a reason, because it transfers to plyos. When they transfer the weight to the front side ball of their foot, that is their forefoot. And that is when they're really bearing weight through their toe flexors. Their windlass mechanism is starting to tense up, and they're utilizing plantar fascia stiffness in that area. And then clearly when their heel is loaded in a squatting pattern, that's a heel like a, I should ask people, not quite the WEC deadlift, but it's pretty close to where when we deadlift, we do ask players to get on the backside ball of their foot and not just lean back on their heels. And then whenever they're doing a squatting motion, we're asking to be rear foot dominant and get behind their feet and get heavy through their heels. And so to me, those are all different things. And generally, when I'm talking about floating heel, I'm asking to be on the backside ball of their foot. And I'm asking to be very precise of not just being on the ball of their foot, but on the backside ball of their foot. To me, that's where you're getting the most tension kind of through the posterior lower leg, and you're asking for the highest demand of force production on the foot intrinsics. When you get to the forefoot, it's a little bit different when you move forward, because you're utilizing windlass mechanism for stiffness there, and you're not able to produce a ton of force in that position. Does that make sense? So like, it's not a heavy force production position versus the midfoot is your heavy force production position. So based on where they're at, we also, we that's how we define the different in jumping drills. We'll go barefoot. And we will define, if you land on your toes and you rock back to your midfoot, once your heel hits in the ground, you are no longer absorbing anymore. Because for us, propulsion is moving away from the midfoot and absorption is moving towards the midfoot. And so players need to know the difference when they're landing. If they go toes, the weight's going to distribute backwards as they get deeper as they're sinking backwards. And once they get past the backside ball of their foot and their heel and crash into the ground, they are no longer absorbing anymore. And so the drill stops when they're there. And so I do think our players are very mindful about when we're teaching landing drills that they are going to the backside ball of their foot and that's it. And that's how they know when they're absorbing correctly. So when it comes to foot positions and so on and so forth, we're kind of sticklers on those things. And then when it comes to if they need floating heel work or not, usually when you get a 4-foot elastic, they're going to want to raise that heel up quite a bit and rock their weight more towards the front of their ball of their foot. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think that's for the coach to decide in the moment. I know for our really heavy muscular movers, they tend to have a very sloppy foot. And so getting them on the backside ball of their foot with their heel, they're going to tend to want to fall back to their heels so they can get rid of some of that tension in there. We try to avoid that for them. But I think when it comes to feeding the forefoot or feeding the midfoot or feeding the rear foot, that's something that's like a coaching decision on the fly based on what issues this person deals with. I can tell you if in season with a 4-foot elastic, I rarely do a lot of heavy floating heel work on the front side ball of their foot because they're, like I said, I'm already trying to keep their plantar fascia, their soleus, their hamstring complex in check. And that's just feeding that beast a little bit more. But from a performance standpoint, I think you could make an argument that'd be very beneficial. Like that would be like feeding that front side ball of the foot could really feed their beast a little bit more, particularly in a world like track where they're going downhill all the time. So I can't give a straight answer to that of who needs more of what. I do know that we watch very closely on where they're able to bear weight and where they're not able to bear weight, and we try to feed in things and feed out those things throughout the course of the season. But we are very specific about what floating heel means to us and what we're actually asking them to do for that reason.
Today's podcast is sponsored by my favorite jump testing and training device, the Plyomat. If you want a jump mat that can not only get standard counter movement jumps and reactive jumps, but also is something you can put into your standard plyometric training, such as hurdle hops and bounds, to gather not only height, but reactive strength, contact time, and add that extra dynamic to your total training session, then check out the Plyomat, and you can head to plyomat.net, that's plyomat.net, to learn more. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, it makes good sense that you'd want an athlete to be able to link a squat or squatting ability to where they find good propulsion. It's just, it's more stimulating. It's more like you feel like you're moving the bar better. And I think that those strengths, like I think Tim Anderson in his most recent book, me on the podcast we did, talked about strength begets strength. Like if you're doing something that's stimulating and feels good, it can it almost like is a radiating thing. And yeah, I guess it's just maybe in season, they're already their bucket's kind of full, I guess, in season, like their 4-foot bucket. Would you say like that's the reason you wouldn't in season? Like they're already being propulsive all over the place.
I think that in my presentation, I talked about using like a farmer's walk on your toes that's really a 4-foot elastic drill as a primer before games. And the players that do those things tend to be 4-foot elastic players, or like athletes before games. Now, if they have a history of some issues where they're showing some signs of not being able to tolerate load through their plantar fascia or something like that, which is a respected diagnosis in the NBA, then clearly I would remove that stimulus in lieu of something different. But those particularly after ankle sprains, when a forefoot elastic like rolls an ankle or something, that they actually really like walking on their toes with weight in their hand. And that is a front side floating heel, front side ball your foot floating heel activity that tends to prime them pretty nicely. So um, before competition, I think is one thing. Training at high volumes for specific adaptations is something different to me. But how much and when and how, I think, is the art of coaching, right? It's like, you have this athlete in front of you, they have a whole history with them. And you also know there are some things changing in the moment throughout the course of a season that allows you to make those decisions or not make those decisions. But generally speaking, that's kind of how we view the foot and foot training in general. And like, it's evolving as we speak. I learn more about a new player's foot every year that allows me to shift my mind. But I do know that I think when I gave that original presentation, I talked about farmer's walks as like just a generalized elastic thing. And what I've learned is it's a very specific kind of elastic person, and the rear foot people really don't like that very much. They tend to like squatting motions like you're talking about, where they're anytime you give them a heel lift, they feel like they're way behind themselves. And so you really have to be very delicate with any sort of midfoot and forefoot loading with that group of people versus a forefoot elastic. Like, they love it. So, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's such a deep conversation because you have concentrics and elastics and forefoot and rear foot dominant. And what does this person enjoy doing? What helps them to feel most activated and fresh and that like poppy snappiness before a game? And so it's definitely worth the nuance of it. With the foot and the farmer's walks, I was thinking about in the rear foot, like the Sports Science Lab discs, and describing these, it's like a disc. There's different types of these. I think there's the Sports Science Lab ones, to my knowledge, are like, I'm holding my hands up. This does no help to anyone listening to this, but it's like, I'm trying to look at it on my floor here in the basement. It's probably about a 5-inch or so diameter disc that your forefoot goes on with a little ball, like a big version of a golf ball at the bottom. And so you could squat on that. You could do single leg squats on that. And it's naturally going to be a more forefoot type squat. The balance isn't so crazy that you're going to like fall over, but it's enough that you really just have some degrees of freedom. Like you have wobble, so you could, and when Marv Marinovich talked about those types of things, he said it allows the athlete to choose the way their body wants to move. And that always stuck with me. And the interesting thing is the Marinovich version discs, I don't think there's that many of these in existence. I don't know if there's too many places to buy them. I bought some and spent way too much on them, getting them from some wooden ones some people threw together from someplace in California. And I use it, but they're huge. They're about 14-inch diameter. So you could put your whole foot, and you could it's the same thing. It's like someone put a doorknob in the bottom. Again, not so much balance that you're like, it's not like you're falling all over the place, but it's enough to give you degrees of freedom. And you could choose to put your midfoot in the middle of those and squat on it. You could choose to put your forefoot and squat on it. I tend to prefer just messing around. I like the way more forefoot and a little bit of toes even feels. But sometimes I'll put like my foot off center. Like I'll put more the ball of my foot in the middle. So it's like it changes the axis of balance. Or I'll put my fifth metatarsal head in the middle, so it changes the axis of balance, just to explore it a little bit. But I just think about somebody, if you just gave someone a big disc and did a single leg squat and said, hey, and you just kind of saw what they picked, I guess, I wonder if that would give you some insight to how they prefer to move their foot in squatting motions.
I've never messed with those, but I like what you're saying in terms of what we're talking about is like, I think what you're suggesting is that people will center their center of gravity over a certain part of their foot kind of naturally. And these rear foot elastics naturally do a better job of staying backwards and staying behind their feet. And the forefoots tend to stay forward, that helps them project themselves forward. I always did it whenever I taught kind of a PT or SFMA sort of lecture to people. One of the things, and it's along the same lines of like, where does posterior chain tone come from and all this stuff. And it's like, why does everyone not have to have the same movement prerequisites? Doesn't make any sense. And I always have people kind of stand up with their feet together and stand as tall as they can and put their hands to their hamstrings, and then just kind of like lean forward to the ball of their foot and feel their hamstrings tense up, then lean back and have them turn off and all those things. And and then they can put their hands on their quads and they can lean back on their heels as far as they can. They can feel their quads tense up. I'm like, what they're doing? I'm like, okay, so you're feeling different preferences of where people's center of gravity lies. And so when I go back on my heel as far as I can, my quads tense up, and the reason why they tense up is so I don't fall over backwards. But these rear foot elastics tend to carry that same heavy quad tone all the time. And it's like, I imagine if they did something like that, they stood on the disc, they would tend to be a little bit further back on their heels where they feel comfortable. The forefoot elastics, they carry that same tension to their posterior chain. And that's because they naturally lean forward on the ball of their foot, and that's to stop them from falling over. But one of the more interesting groups to think about on this is the group that everyone says the FMS is like so perfect for, which is like the muscular people. And the reason why they say that, I think, is because they will naturally stand in their midfoot very well. And so there's a lot of stuff online right now where people are suggesting, I even saw one where they were suggesting LeBron and Usain Bolt would benefit from having a more wide toe box in their shoes they're wearing to play. And this is a very low resolution view of how people function on their feet. And like for most ADLs, maybe longevity, sure, you can make the argument that having good midfoot stability and a midfoot stance is really beneficial. But that's not giving credit to how these athletes learn to function with their center of gravity in their feet. And so one of the ways that I think is really funny is if you take someone with a heavy powerlifting background and you do like a straight vertical jump, no movement, just stand there. Like sometimes they're pretty impressive. They can show you some explosiveness. But if you get them to a running start and have them try and run and jump horizontal to vertical, or even shoot even a single leg takeoff horizontal to horizontal, they have a really difficult time figuring out how to use any other part of their foot besides their midfoot. So I always laugh at powerlifting. I fall in this category, so I'm laughing at myself. Is like I will get a running start, and then you'll see them almost like gather themselves and like stop real fast before they jump over a hurdle or jump onto a box. And the reason is like their feet are so suited for like, or the way they manage their center of gravity is so suited to be like right over their feet, squat down, squat up. For us, the midfoot, backside ball of the foot, heels like barely touching the ground, is the highest force producing area of the foot. So when you're like super strong and you're carrying heavy load, that's where your foot naturally goes. And if you train there long enough, you kind of lose the ability to use any other part of it. So like a lot of times these people that are really good at these static balancing tasks, and they use their wide toe box and they have all this stuff, they're missing. I imagine they would be really good at balancing on a disc on their midfoot. I imagine they naturally get really tall and like be very, firm there. But there's also a downside to those midfoot dominant, static, still standing stuff on flat surface. That's why I like when you're using the Dynadisc, allows people to choose kind of where their weight's going to be, because it's a balancing task that also gives the forefoots and the rear foots a shot. A shot to be successful. So anyway, that's like a whole different conversation. But I do think to some degree it's like, it's going to be reflective of where you feel comfortable with your center of gravity, and your muscle tone down the chain is going to reflect that, and your movement style is going to reflect that. And so in people that have like long training backgrounds as far as powerlifting, or are working on one very specific aspect of over their midfoot, everything straight up and down, and it's reflective in their movement styles afterwards. So, I don't know. You get me on these long tangents and just talking about a balanced disc. That's what it is.
It's interesting to think about in the sense of like lifting a heavy weight on a flat surface is kind of an invented thing. Like it's not in the realm of real natural human function. Of course, humans, through primitive history needed to squat and bend, but not in the way that we do formally in training. And so, I imagine most of their tasks were more hinging, if anything, hinging and dragging and carrying and pushing, pulling, running, jumping, more things that do prioritize a little bit more of that forefoot to, I think like use like the floating heel, even outside, like just things that don't really hinge on being able to load the midfoot well and then squat deep into it. And even when you mentioned like the Dynadiscs, like people talk about, oh, someone got hurt and they did rehab and they came back and they're jumping higher. I wonder if part of that might be, well, hey, you just trained your foot in the way it wanted to be trained because you had access to that now because you're on something that allows you to dig into the part of your foot that needs it and to the dynamic stabilization, like a little more intrinsic foot muscles. It's different. It's novel. It's, I think there's a lot there. And I think we dismiss it because, oh, it's balance. That's just training room stuff, and it's not very, you can't load it that heavy. I mean, actually with the disc stuff, you can. I'm not sure. I think some of the Marinovich stuff, I do think they found interesting ways to load some of those things. So it is, it's certainly something I think is a valuable topic. And yeah, I mess around with discs all the time, especially in like warm up. Like I'll warm up with all sorts of ways and then squat, or slant boards, like different ways to squat on slant boards on a single leg and just exploring tensioning and then go do your squat.
That's awesome. I think you're right with this is again a different topic of like, we tend to write that stuff off, and usually we write that stuff off because there's a research article that's trying to make it very like a univariate thing, and prove that it's not correlated to X, Y, or Z. And it turns out like, not many things are correlated to like specific outputs all the time. And so like, but they do have value. And I think I mentioned that in the last one is I think we've gone, there's something to be said for evidence-based practice, but we shouldn't forget that clinical expertise and practitioner expertise also is equal part to evidence-based practice as research, as the evidence in the literature. And so is player preference or patient values is the third 33% of evidence-based practice. And what you'll find is that the evidence for some of that stuff doesn't often line up with athlete or client or patient preference. Like they found use for that in their life. And there's coaches that have found use for those things. And I think we try to dumb things down to just, a research article or a randomized control trial or something and then deem them useless or not. But we get ourselves in a very dicey ground in strength and conditioning. So I'm happy you said that. And it's one of the reasons that when we talked about the FMS, because clearly the research indicates that it does not predict injury. Doesn't mean it's useless. It just means how you use it and how you learn to value it is different.
Yeah. With preference, I did want to ask you one thing before I segue into the hybrid. But like you said, we had all this time to talk about, FMS and the foot and probably be a little squeezed on time to talk about hybrid athletes. But you mentioned it is interesting because you would think, oh, forefoot. Well, every athlete should like warming up with forefoot drills. But then you're mentioning, okay, we have these, rear foots or muscular movers, knee dominants who maybe they didn't like the farmer's walk loaded before the game or as an activation. I'd be curious, what do those athletes, I mean, I think you said squatting, but is there anything with the foot or involving the foot that activates those athletes, or maybe specifically sorry, I'm like changing this question as I think about it. I'm like, okay, like let's just polarize it, like a muscular mover, knee dominant mover, that what do they like before the game, like from both a foot and a strength movement perspective?
There's just like I'd have two types of elastics. I do have some version of two types of muscular movers. I know we're kind of running short on time on this, so I'll try and make this fast. Generally propulsive movers, we act like it's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. In basketball, I don't think we ever really see, very rarely, truly like a heavy propulsive mover like you'd see in powerlifting, or something like that. So we tend to get more like this is bad. This is just the words I'm choosing to describe what I'm thinking right now is a stiff muscular. A stiff muscular is a midfoot dominant, midfoot dominant, 2-foot jumper, tends to test well in static, like vertical jump. This is like their vertical jump is like their jam. Like they will wow you with their jump heights in a static stance. The advantages of a muscular mover, it's not all bad. The advantages are they tend to hold their ground really well on their feet and they move well from a dead stop. So we see this in basketball a lot. These are probably some of your best defenders because they can come settled on their midfoot on the perimeter and move very quickly laterally or side to side from a dead stop. They also, just based on usually the shape of their skeleton, when you run into them and you hit them, they're very difficult to move. Rear foot elastics they're spiral people. So when you hit them, they have a really hard time resisting rotation. Things like, so they tend to flop around a little bit more. These guys don't. You know when you hit them, they're usually, the more muscular propulsive they are, the more of a cinder block they are. All that being said, the difference as you move through a hybrid of a like true propulsive to more of a stiff propulsive comes down to time to take off and counter movement depth of their jump. And so a stiffer muscular will have a less counter movement depth when they want to jump. They'll usually have really high speed unweighting periods, or when they unweight to drop down. So they tend to generate a lot of knee stiffness in a flat foot position. And there's upsides and downsides of these strategies too. One of them is that if you're testing vertical jump and you're stand still and you're judging all your athletes by how high they get off the ground, right? And that's very common in strength and conditioning. There's a little bit of a missed interpretation there, because what really matters in a standstill jump is basically your stiffness rating. In terms of, in basketball anyway, is your athleticism going to translate to the game or not? So people that have really deep counter movements and even deep slow counter movements, but show like really unbelievable amounts of propulsive power, they generate what's like a massive propulsive impulse or a net concentric impulse, or different technologies use a different language. And that's what determines jump height. And so if you look at the highest box jump of all time, they're usually going like down butt to heels and jumping and pushing. And the reason why they're doing that is that extra time gives them a little bit more concentric impulse, and that creates displacement. That sort of jumping style will not show up on a basketball court, regardless of how high you jump. And the reason is that you never have time to display that. And so we've had people that are, warm up, layup line, dunk champions. They can't find their way into a basketball game athletically. And the reason is they're lacking stiffness. And so there, on the flip side, there are people that aren't that impressive as far as jump height is concerned. Like if you look at how high their vertical jump is, like, oh, that's kind of average. When you take into account their counter movement depth isn't very high, their eccentric speed is very high, they're still midfoot dominant people, they fall, like that's an athleticism that will find its way into the game. And so there's a good advantage of that. And so they will play more athletically than they test. That's a really good quality to find in someone. So propulsive athletes tend to be, maybe, I think the far end tend to be a little bit more hip dominant, where they like to deadlift, where these are like the very extreme, like I'm going to hinge before I bend my knees. And then as you get into kind of the more stiff muscular, you're probably dealing with squatting. These are the guys that I've talked about, like to do fast flywheels before games, like really light wheel, but high speed motions. They love that stiff muscular loves a depth jump that isn't asking them for ground contact time. It's asking them for height. So they're two different things. So you're going to get a big load into the midfoot, maybe a longer ground contact time before they explode up, versus a forefoot person who's going to like that fast ground contact time. They stay on the front side ball of their foot. They're going to hobble over hurdles like that. So usually the real heavy, true propulsive, I've only had a couple of those in the NBA. Those are really common. I think when I trained football, they tend to be more hingy, deadlifting. I like to feel like we had some guys like to deadlift before games. And the stiff muscular, those are a little bit different. High eccentric knee stiffness, high eccentrically oriented knee dominant, using knee stiffness to take off and reverse their energy, still on their midfoot. They tend to like things, depth jumps feel good for them as part of their warm up, or just jumping exercise in general, from a midfoot position. And I think I showed that video of the fast flywheel. Those are generally knee stiffness people.
Yeah, it makes me think of Paul Cater's been on the show a few times. He's out in Monterey, and he has a ton of like VersaPulley and flywheel and K-Box. He's been using it forever. And Paul is definitely like a knee dominant stiffness, like concentric type individual. And it makes sense, like that that feels really good. And I've used the cable. I use it all the time, and I like the way it makes my tendons feel, but it doesn't necessarily get me ready. Like it would be good like after. For me, it's good as like a high rep, like tissue quality. I really like it for that perspective. I don't do it and it feels like, oh yeah, I'm gonna loop this in a potentiation circuit or something. Like I don't think I would loop it in like a French contrast, but Paul would have a great time with it with French contrast, I think. These days, I actually use the belt on my K-Box for max isos a lot. That's been more of a prime use. Like that's my jam a little bit with like the foot stuff and things like that. So it's kind of, tool, but then here's the different ways you can use it for a different population.
The one thing I wanted to say is I thought I did a good job explaining. I don't know, maybe I didn't do a good job. I don't know. I think I do, and then I re-listen to myself and I don't. But explaining how I'm utilizing movement screening areas for rear foot and forefoot elastic, what areas I'm focusing on. For the muscular movers, almost always I'm focusing on extension, mainly of the hips. And the reason is they tend to hip extension is their motor. So in a propulsive person, triple extension. This is the one area where like triple extension. This is the people that like probably live and die by triple extension. And throughout the course of our season, I try to focus on areas that I think is going to accumulate stress. And for them, managing their hip extension abilities, even if it's like deep hip flexor ability, like they tend to get more soft tissue work up in the deep hip flexors. I tend to do a little bit more just managing to make sure that they're not accumulating tone in those areas. And then also for a different reason, but usually these people are very prone to pulls, like muscle strains, versus our elastic people are generally tendinopathies, ligamentous type stuff. And so these people, because they tend to pull or push their way around everywhere, it's not very efficient. And so we tend to focus on tissue quality along groin and hamstring for them too. But hip extension is a big one. Usually if you keep their hip extension in check, then their hamstring's feeling pretty good. So I wanted to add that in because I know I was trying to loop in the FMS into the discussion there. But anyway, I'm a muscular person by trade. I think I told you I was a competitive Olympic weightlifter. And a lot of my learnings is recognizing things I just could not do and things that I was excelling at versus other people. And I'm like, then I watch some of these other athletes that are doing amazing things that, can't. And I was a great cleaner when I was in college and, deadlifter, big time deadlifter, but like I still do the thing where I'm trying to run up to a box to jump and I almost have to like come to a complete stop. And my jump height is almost the same from a standstill. It's like no different.
Yeah, it's me and you are like opposite ends of the spectrum. You even mentioned like the muscle tears. Like I've almost never had a muscle tear issue like with hamstrings doing track all those years. And unless the times there was these small time frames where I did a ton of lifting and very little like sprinting, and those were the two times basically that I ended up tweaking a hand. It wasn't even that bad, but other than that, it's just been like because I bounce, like I just don't. It just isn't the quite same demand. Even too with like you mentioned the hip hinging, like I just by nature haven't had a lot of like heavy RDLs, a lot of heavier hip hinging in my program, and I think it's just because it just wasn't something that was that beneficial for me personally. And a lot of the athletes, the population that, those similar population individuals I work with, not necessarily super beneficial for them either. So I'm like, but like you mentioned, for a muscular mover, it might be a different story. And so it's just interesting to think about how our own preferences can dictate some things that end up in the program based off of that. And there's a lot there.
As you're talking about this stuff, I'm thinking of other ways coaches can kind of help at least see things the way I see them. And one of them is we test our guys on force plates a lot, and they go hands on hips, and you can do it however you want. But their jump strategy, aside from their numbers, data aside, just watching them move, tells you kind of a lot about what they're trying to do. And this is just observation. I don't think I've ever spoken this out loud before, but I'm going to try to do it right now. This is my first time, so show me some grace on this. True propulsive movers will start their hands on hips, standing tall, feet flat. They will start with a hinge, and then they'll go down into a knee bend slowly, and then they'll try to really push their way out of a deep counter movement. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then you move into the stiff propulsive person. And what they're going to do is be really good job on their forefoot or on their midfoot, hands on hips, and they're going to drop down faster, but they're going to go straight into a knee bend, stay on their midfoot, drop down very fast and get out of it. Sometimes those are very impressive to watch that motion. But one of the key distinctions is when they stay on their midfoot, they're straight up and down at the top of their jumps. Their body is very vertical. But these elastic people are a little bit different to me. I'm curious if this is something you would do. A lot of times I'll see the rear foot elastics, when they go up in the jump, their feet kick out in front of them. And that's a reflection of where their center of gravity is, their feet. So a lot of our heavy rear foot guys, when they jump in the air, they'll actually kick their feet out in front. Or they feel really uncomfortable using their hands and their hips because they want to use these spirals with their hands. And so they have a really hard time keeping their hands on their hips because they want to like do like a chicken wing motion with their arms to get a spiral action. That's the rear foots. The forefoots almost always fall off the force plate going forwards. They'll land and they'll land on their tiptoes and just fall over forward. And that's just again a reflection of where their center of gravity wants to be in relation to their feet. Neither of the elastics, I won't say the rear foots have a better chance at this. The forefoots usually aren't that impressive when they jump on a force plate. They're like usually like, really, that's all you're doing right now. But what I've learned is just to watch these strategies and just let it sink in instead of just staring at the data all the time. And I think there's some telling things about how people want to do things. And you're a bouncing person, so you're gonna reflect that in your counter movement jump. And these propulsive people that are really pushing and straining to get out of the bottom, it's going to be reflective. It's not going to look as bouncy. They're going to start with a hinge and squat down real slow and deep, then push out. So that's the first time I've tried to speak those things, but I do see our players do that all the time, where how they jump and their strategy they're using to do it just a regular jump tells you a lot about what they're actually trying to do.
Yeah, for me, I go straight up and down pretty well without like a lot of movement either way. Like I don't kick out in front, but I know I've changed over time. So when I was in high school, I weighed less, like probably about 10 pounds less than, my 20s or mid 20s when I started the weightlifting and more mass. And I remember jumping, I would like stand under the hoop and test my standing vertical periodically just to see. And how I did it then, like my senior year of high school, I don't know how it's funny how I remember this. I remember not knee bending at all, or hip bending especially, but not really hip bending at all. Very little even in the knees, but it was almost all just loading up my forefoot to bounce. It was just like this, how can I load my feet up to spring me up? And the funny thing is I was still jumping about as high doing that as even once I was lifting later in life. In many ways, I think I did exceed it eventually by a few inches, but to exceed that, my running, like those times my running vertical would just crash, which is crazy. I had to ride that strength so exclusively. And also too, I remember there was an old video of a dunk. I wish I should get this VHS. It was a dunk contest I did in high school, and I was watching my run up compared to 4 years later with a lot more squatting. And I don't even think my heels barely hit the ground on the run up to the single leg jump. But then I'm like, just exploding off the ground, like elbows are almost at the rim on reverse dunks. I'm like, man, this is so crazy. Of course, it's me looking at it later in life and seeing how I chose to move. But then later, even 4 years later, lots of squatting, heavier loading, I'm running and approaching flat-footed virtually. It's such a different style. And I lost a lot of that was a lot of lifting at the expense of not playing basketball as much. And of course now, understanding if I'm not playing basketball, I know how to load the plyometric battery and the movement battery in a way that can replicate it. But it is interesting to consider. So long story short is I don't, but also it's just because I think I'm such a mindful person of the jump, like in the timing and like I game the test. I'm sure but now I'm way more knee dominant, like because of all the squatting, I'm kind of turned into a weird, I probably have, they talk about the layers of compensation and I don't know how many layers of whatever I have in there, but yeah.
No, I think that's sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no worries at all.
Interesting to know is that like the big question is that good or bad? And like that's what I don't think I'll ever have the answer to for every individual person. I mean we have some there are people that come in that are very forefoot elastic, but forefoot elastic people, I really worry about gaining muscle mass very quickly.
Mm.
Any sort of elastic player, I really worry about gaining muscle mass very quickly. But then it's like, okay, so if this person doesn't gain muscle mass, they're not going to make it in the NBA. And so then it's a question of how much of your dynamic ability am I willing to sacrifice in order to give you a dying chance to be in this league?
Mm.
And like, because everything you do has a trade-off. There's no solutions, I don't think. I think that um, you know, do I lean into your strength and just make you that? Well, currently where you're at on that isn't good enough. And so we need to give you, so it's like, I don't have enough, people's, clearly your strategies changed over time. I think only maybe you might know if that's good or bad, or as a coach, it's a very, very difficult answer to come up with. And so I think from the last podcast, the biggest question is, well, how do you know if this person moves like this, did you do this? And it's like, well, for us, I'm dealing with a very, very specific population, and like maybe the most specific population. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
the top 0.1% of players in the world are here. And so it allows me to not flirt with changing them that much, versus if I'm dealing with a more developmental population like I did in college. And even then, like that's a pretty high level population. And so that's always the question, is like, I'm posing a stimulus. What's the adaptation going to be? There's going to be a trade-off. It's not all going to be positive, regardless of how much we'd like to think that every time we lift a weight, the only thing that happens is good things. And so the question I always ask is like, what is the trade-off? Is this good or bad? How am I influencing this person? And like, it's a different answer every time. And so, when I present on this stuff, I don't make it to be so binary of like, if you see this person jump like this, then you do this. And like, it's easier to talk about it that way, but the individual decision making, the N of one decision making that goes on is a little more complex. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to with yourself, is like, clearly it's different, good different, or bad different, or just different. Like it, it is what it is. Like it's probably positive in some ways and negative in some others. But that's the art of coaching. I think that's like the fun part of it all.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be very boring if it was like, okay, here's the perfect way to squat. All players squat like this. Here's the perfect way to do a deadlift. All players deadlift like this. Like or here's the magical sets and reps. Done. All right, cool. All right, we're good. So I did mention hybrids at the beginning. I know we're out of time, but maybe if we can just do 5 minutes, maybe we'll have to save that for another time in many ways. But this was the thing that I wrote this down because it slipped my mind about an hour ago. Is you had talked about the rear foot jumper who can step back. And this made me think a little bit about the hybrid. But I was thinking about like a LeBron dunking from the free throw line versus a Michael Jordan dunking from the free throw line. Like Michael Jordan dribbled it. He's a little more lopey, but then he can there's a picture of him in the air. His swing leg is super internally rotated. So he's like jumping and like eking out this rotation to still dunk from the free throw line. And he had, obviously incredible step back, spins, all that stuff. So that just made me think, oh yeah, I don't think he was a true, probably pure rear foot. He probably is somewhere in the middle, but it's interesting how someone could do that skill in almost like, we could say a hybrid. I know the hybrid you're talking about, someone who can, lateral and the knee bending and all that stuff, but that's another hour talk ahead of us.
That's the beauty of great athletes, man. Is like, even the level I'm at, there's most of the people I work with will generally lend. All of them have some sort of quality of the others. There's not anyone that's like zero propulsive ability whatsoever at this level. But like the beauty of people like Michael Jordan, he's one of the all-time greatest athletes ever, is that he's going to display a lot of these qualities, that he can do a lot of different things. And it makes him very, very difficult to contend with as an opponent. But like, I would imagine LeBron has more stiff muscular attributes than Jordan did, whereas Jordan has more rear foot attributes than what LeBron did. And I clearly haven't worked with either one of these people, but just watching them on film. So like, the hybrid to me is nothing more than like, okay, so you clearly don't have one dominant movement style. And these are the people that are most fun to train, in my opinion, because they're really hard to screw up and they're really easy to get a lot of things, because you're not beating your head against the wall. And we certainly have players that have like what I consider to be, if I just separated those into 4 things, which is like purely propulsive muscular, stiff muscular, rear foot elastic, forefoot elastic, I can probably give you, most of our guys have a dominant one, and a few of our players or a few players I've worked with have like components of two of them that make them very difficult to contend with. Jordan's definitely an example of that, who could step back on you, also blow by you, also like
we guarded Iverson too. There was that video. It's like Iverson crossed over all the Bulls except for Jordan, and then Jordan's guarding him, and he was so internally rotated and crouched down, like to go from probably his normal position of defending someone more his height to to the options to change and have those options to, okay, I'm going to use this strategy to go guard this guy who's going to try to cross me over. I'm not going to let him cross me. It's just amazing. Like, yeah, the options. And then the question would be, well, can you do anything when you're younger to have more options? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's looking at the roots of the tree and all that. I just think again, we're out of time. So
Iverson may have been, sorry. I could go on for days.
Yeah.
Iverson's your prototypical rear foot guy. Like, that's like a great example, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Crossover step back out. Yeah. And we'll save it for the next one. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I mean, I have a whole page of notes and, a bunch of questions to save for the next time, but it was really, you gave me tons of things to think about, consider, and I really appreciate you being on here again for this part 2. Thanks for being on the show again.
Love the conversation, man. Just my thoughts.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.